Hey guys, tonight we stand on the edge of a wind-swept fjord, the salty spray whipping your hair as you peer out over churning gray waters. You probably won't survive this without a stiff breeze rattling your bones, but that's half the thrill. The silhouette of a slender longship crests the horizon, dragon-headed prow slicing through the waves with effortless grace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments so we know where in the world you're plotting your own sea voyage. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a narrow wooden gangplank, your boots thudding against damp planks as the creaking timbers welcome you aboard. The air here tastes of salt and spruce resin from the ship's hull, an aroma that will soon be forever imprinted on your senses. This is the dawn of Norse exploration, a time when hardy seafarers from Scandinavia first dared to breach horizons beyond their sheltered fjords. By around 874 AD, Viking settlers had already founded the first communities in Iceland, a feat of navigational daring few cultures could match. Your eyes drift to the carved serpent prow, its eyes painted deep red with iron oxide staring defiantly into the mist. Fringe sources suggest some captains even sprinkled powdered dragon's bone into their oars' oil slick, believing it summoned protective spirits. But historians still argue whether such rituals ever truly reached the high sea or remained coastal superstition. You notice burly warriors in hooded cloaks stacking barrels of salted herring and nets dripping with fresh cod, evidence that these voyages blended subsistence fishing with bold territorial scouting. Below deck, wooden chests creak as two young skalds recite epic couplets, their voices low and rhythmic like melodic thunder. You lean in, catching a snippet tales of Odin's ravens, guiding lost warriors, a quirk of lore that melded divine myth with real-world seamanship. Above, the navigator squints at a rudimentary chart sketched on vellum. No compasses here, yet just coastlines, headlands, and a mental map passed down by word of mouth. As the long ship's sails unfurl in the stiff breeze, you feel its billowing canvas tug at the mast like a living beast. Historians still argue whether early Norse sails were woven from wool treated with animal fats for waterproofing or left plain for lighter weight. Either way, these square rigs propelled vessels at speeds up to 8 knots on a good wind day. You grip a length of rope and test its weight. Coir fibers, imported from distant lands, a quirky nod to the Vikings' extensive trade networks that spanned from Constantinople to the Caspian Sea. A sudden cry from the crow's nest shatters your reverie. Land ho! A jagged silhouette of distant cliffs emerges, reminiscent of the Scottish Isles you'll soon chart. Mainstream accounts record Viking landings on these rocky shores by the late 8th century, launching raids that would echo through Western Europe. Yet, a whispered aside among your crewmates credits a certain Ivan Skegya with using a polished tortoiseshell disc, an unverified fringe claim suggesting an earlier experiment in primitive sun-shadow alignment. You press your palm against cool wood, feeling the vibrations of planks flexing with each wave. The rhythm lulls your racing heart as the Viking world unfolds around you, raw timber, roaring wind, and the unspoken promise of lands unseen. Remember that tale about crocodile dung sunscreen used in Egyptian voyages? Well, these Norse mariners had their own odd maritime hacks. Some sailors stuffed sheep wool in their ears to muffle the wind's howl, a practice historians still argue whether it hindered or helped in steering. Glancing seaward, you glimpse gulls wheeling overhead, their shrill calls mingling with the faint clang of metal as a blacksmith aboard sharpens an axe's edge, always ready for both exploration and encounter. You feel the ship's motion settle into a steady hum, like a giant heartbeat beneath your feet. Here, at the very threshold of the unknown, you realize these Vikings were more than raiders. They were pioneers of invisible highways carved by wind and wave. Your gaze drifts to a carved wooden bench where the helmsman sits guiding the steering oar with practiced ease. Polar lights glow faintly on the northern horizon, an eerie backdrop to an already otherworldly scene. In the centuries to come, those same lights would be explained by science, but tonight they remain a silent witness to the beginning of a navigational revolution. As you settle onto a coil of rope, you think of the sagas yet unwritten, the islands yet discovered, and the crystals yet to be grooved into navigation lore. The world beyond these shores awaits, and soon you'll feel the true pulse of open water beneath your palms. For now, though, you breathe in the brine-laden breeze and let the ship's gentle sway ease you deeper into this story, one that begins here amidst the hissing gales and pounding waves of the Norse dawn. You lean against the ship's rail as dawn's first pale light filters through low clouds, illuminating the restless sea with a ghostly silver glow. The world feels suspended in that delicate hour, and you find yourself pondering how Vikings managed these voyages before sundials or compasses came along. Historians still argue whether these seafarers first noted the stars or the sun's angle before trusting any skyborne guide. By the late 8th century, mariners across the Mediterranean were already using rudimentary celestial navigation, but the Norse took those ideas and adapted them to their own brutal environment. You recall that around 800 AD, Byzantine captains employed the pole star to maintain northerly courses, a practice that drifted northward through traders and travelers. Yet, when you squint at the pale North Star burning overhead, you realize it barely clings above the horizon in higher latitudes, leaving early Vikings desperate for another constant. A stray wisp of sea fog drifts across your face, cold and damp, as you remember the first mainstream record of Norse star charts, an icy, rune-etched slab discovered in a Greenland settlement showing a circular arrangement of dots marking key constellations. Vikings might have sketched a crude band of stars along the ship's rail, a kind of mental protractor. Yet some fringe accounts insist that sagas mention seers using polished arm rings as reflective surfaces to bounce moonlight onto makeshift star maps, but historians still argue whether such poetic flourishes disguised actual technique or merely embellished heroic lore. Your boots lightly scuff the damp deck as you head toward the mast, where the navigator examines a wooden rod tipped with brass. This sunrod, historians note, was the ancestor of later European astronomers' instruments, capable of measuring the sun's elevation with surprising accuracy for its time. In the bright summer above the Arctic Circle, the sun skirts the horizon for hours so that Rod could deliver a precise angle, even as the disk lingered low for much of the day. You can almost hear the creak of that rod as it rotates in your hand, slowly aligning with the sun's shaft. Modern experiments have replicated this method, showing that a trained navigator could determine latitude within 1 degree, about 60 nautical miles, just by marking the sun's height at local noon. But as the ship pitches and rolls, maintaining a steady measure seems impossible. Fringe rumor claims some sailors use the reflective surface of a polished crystal or even a whale's tooth inlaid with metal to stabilize their reading, a quirky detail that fuels debate about how widespread such makeshift aids really were. The navigator traces a finger across a leather-bound journal, its pages marked with sketches of concentric circles and arcane runic annotations. He mutters about the sun's arc across the horizon, noting how its height grows higher toward midsummer and shrinks as autumn approaches. You settle beside him and glimpse a note declaring that on June 21st at 66 degrees north, the sun doesn't fully set, a polar day, so relentless that Vikings complained of insomnia, far worse than any mortal ailment. Historians still argue whether those midnight sun complaints prompted expeditions southward or simply fueled endless mead hall bragging rights. A breeze shifts, tugging at the tapestry of ropes overhead, and you glance upward at a patch of sky where a solitary cloud drifts. Through that break, the sun's rays form a bright spot. On the deck, an impromptu sundial marking the passage of time for the crew. You notice a small wooden peg driven into a carved gnomon mounted near the foremast. Every hour, the shadow ticks past another glyph carved into the deck. Mainstream records from 9th century Norse farmsteads mention similar markers on granite stones, proving these people had no shortage of timekeeping tricks. Just then, a deckhand slips a chipped chunk of quartz from his pocket, holding it aloft. He rotates the crystal slowly, watching light fracture into a spectrum of colors. He grins and boasts that this rainbow in glass could help spot the sun's exact bearing, even when the disk itself hid behind clouds. Historians still argue whether quartz fragments were common on Viking ships or reserved for wealthy skippers who brought them from Baltic trading centers. You take the crystal and peer through it, turning it until a sliver of polarized light cuts a clear line across the deck, an instant guide pointing roughly south. You hand the quartz to the navigator, who scribbles a new runic annotation, Sun Finder. He tells you that in trials conducted during a modern reenactment, crews, using quartz slivers, navigated nearly as accurately as those with full sunstones, but only when the crystal's cut happened to align with the sun's polarization axis. Fringe storytellers claim Norse crystal cutters intentionally fashioned these fragments at specific angles, yet no archaeological site has confirmed such precision tooling. As you walk toward the stern, the horizon clears, revealing distant ice floes, drifting like ghostly islands. Your breath plumes in the crisp air as you recall that Vikings once wintered near these floes, collecting driftwood and subsisting on seal and walrus. Polar light flickers faintly before fading, reminding you of the delicate dance between sun and ice that made celestial navigation so crucial. The navigator invites you to stand beside him at the steering oar's base. You grasp the oar's shaft, feeling every subtle shift as the helmsman adjusts for hidden currents. You ask if the sunrod and quartz trick worked in rough seas. He chuckles, admitting the method faltered during storms, leaving crews to follow coastlines until skies cleared. Historians still argue whether coastal piloting remained the primary fallback or if sunstone lore pushed them to rely on cloud-piercing crystals even when conditions deteriorated. Behind you, the skalds have begun a low chant about journeys by starlight and sun-swallowing monsters of the deep. Their voices mingle with the groaning wood and distant gull cries, weaving myth into reality. You close your eyes for a moment, trusting the navigator's measures and the crystal's silent guidance. In that instant, the sea feels less like a boundless void and more like a vast map drawn by angles of light and shadow. A final trickle of polar light brushes the horizon as the sun slips just out of view. You exhale slowly, sensing the fragile triumph of human ingenuity and a hint of the legends that would swirl around these tools for centuries. The horizon before you darkens to navy blue, but you already know the way home, thanks to the union of sunrod precision and crystal magic. You step into the dim glow of lantern light as the longship drifts into an uncharted inlet, the timber walls echoing with whispered stories. Saga tellers gather on deck, their breath visible in the chill air, and you sidle close to catch every hushed word. They speak of a legendary crystal, the sunstone said to hold the power to turn even midnight's darkness into golden noon. You probably won't survive a night without its glow, they joke, though you suspect they're only half serious. One skald clears his throat and begins with a mainstream fact. Early Icelandic annals record Viking monks using polished crystals to read holy scriptures by lamplight, when candles failed a clear precedent for practical uses of clear stones. But then the tale veers into lore. This stone could capture the sun's glint, no matter how overcast the sky, revealing hidden beams of polarized light that guided lost ships. You lean forward as the skald recounts how King Olaf himself allegedly possessed a sunstone set in gold, carried across stormy seas to ensure safe passage. Historians still argue whether such royal sundries ever existed or were pure embellishment in saga verse. A fringe whisper cuts through the murmur. Some claim the sunstone could even repel storms when held aloft, casting a ring of calm around the vessel. You raise an eyebrow, recalling that curious detail about Norse skippers tossing mead overboard to appease storm gods, but historians still argue whether intoxicating offerings improved morale or were purely ritual. You tuck the notion away for later, sensing that truth and myth have always danced together in Viking lore. A flick of lantern light glints off a crewman's neck, clasp a small crystal that fractures beams into slivers of rainbow. It's nothing like the legendary sunstone, but its simple reflection hints at how powerful concentrated light seemed to these people. You reach out imagining that if you angled that gem just right, it could cut through fog like a beacon. The skald smiles at your fascination and warns that untrained hands could shatter the stone, burying its magic forever in shards. Another storyteller swaps in describing saga verses written centuries after the purported golden age of sunstone use. He quotes lines about a gleaming eye of Saul perched on the foremast, illuminating every dark corner of the ship like a hearth fire in a frozen hall. Yet, archaeological digs have uncovered no such mounts, just broken shards of quartz and cordierite in shipwreck debris. Historians still argue whether those fragments were used as navigation aids or simply ballast scattered when a vessel foundered. You settle onto a barrel, feeling its sturdy frame press beneath you. The skald's voice softens as he recounts how sailors once feared the stone's power as much as they revered it. Legends claimed that if a ship veered too close to the Arctic Circle, the sunstone's glow would intensify until it blinded the crew, luring them onto jagged ice floes. A quirky detail follows some Vikings supposedly tied leather blindfolds around their eyes when testing the stone, believing that sightless guidance on crystal clarity proved worthiness. Historians still argue whether this ritual ever moved beyond the pages of poetic saga. A sudden gust rattles the lanterns, sending dancing silhouettes across the hull. The skald leans in, describing a notorious voyage where a captain's sunstone cracked under the weight of his greed. He'd sold his share of mead to buy a larger crystal, desperate to outshine rival chieftains. But when he raised it overhead at midnight, it fractured with a sharp crack, an omen that storm gods had claimed his arrogance. Whether that tale is true or a sailor's parable about hubris, remains an open scholarly debate. You rub your hands for warmth and glance at the horizon where dark clouds cluster like angry sea monsters waiting below water. A crew member hums a mournful chant of a Sunstone's lament, a minor melody said to mimic how the crystal mourns if mishandled. You shiver, imagining that delicate structure clattering against the deck boards. This ritual lament ensures the stone's power won't be squandered, or so the refrain goes. The storyteller then describes how different sagas offer conflicting descriptions of the sunstone's appearance. Some say it glowed with a steady white light. Others claim it pulsed with red and gold hues, like a dying ember. Mainstream accounts of polished cordierite from Norwegian quarries describe deep blue crystals that fracture light only faintly, hardly the blazing magic of legend. Historians still argue whether color played any role in the stone's navigational function, or if the hues were later romantic additions. You notice the helmsman leaning on the steering oar, eyes half closed as he listens. He murmurs that practical trials in calm summer seas showed only modest polarization effects from typical crystals, just enough to influence a seasoned navigator, but not magic. Yet the skald insists that when sky and stone align perfectly, the sunstone becomes an instrument more reliable than any compass for tracking latitude. Whether empirical measurement or mythic interpretation, the stone's reputation endured. Above you, the lantern flame steadies, and the skald's final words hang in the salty air. Hold fast to your faith and your crystal, and no night shall swallow you. You tuck your own quartz fragment into your cloak pocket, testing its weight. It might not be King Olaf's fabled gem, but tonight it feels like a tether to legend. As the ship's timbers creak into a deeper silence, you lean back and let the saga's echoes drift over you like a lullaby. The Sunstones legend swirls in your mind, half-remembered dream and half-raw fact, beckoning you toward an age where belief and technique fused on those northern seas. You're standing at the bow as dawn breaks the sun, skimming the ocean's surface and scattering a pale liquid shimmer across the waves. The world feels new again, as though the sea itself has been reborn each morning. You probably won't survive long staring straight at that glare without squinting, but you can't tear your eyes away. Today you witness the discovery of polarized light, an invisible force that Vikings harnessed to guide their vessels. Historians still argue whether the Norse recognized polarization naturally or learned it through borrowing scientific ideas from Mediterranean traders. Mainstream accounts suggest that early sailors noticed how the reflected glare off water changed quality depending on their viewing angle, an everyday observation that confounded ancient mariners across cultures. By the 9th century, Greek philosophers had already described polarized light when they observed how certain crystals split sunlight. But those ideas seldom traveled north. A fringe claim insists that Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, first noted polarization when he watched sunlight refract through ice crystals hanging from his cave roof, creating brilliant arcs of rainbow hues. According to this story, he smashed a chunk of ice into a smooth pane, held it up at various angles, and immediately grasped that it could reveal the sun's hidden direction even under overcast skies. Historians still argue whether Eric's icy experiments ever occurred or are merely romantic embellishment in saga retellings. You step carefully across wet planks to peer down at a pool of water on deck where the navigator has placed a thin slice of mica. As sunlight passes through, you see bright and dark bands, evidence of polarized light. This mainstream experiment, simple yet profound, would later underlie 19th century optical science. But you're the first witness amid the creaking wood. The navigator handles another fragment, a piece of cordierite, roughly the size of your palm, polishing its edges with oilcloth until smooth. A mist drifts across the horizon as he tilts the crystal, and you watch in fascination as the glare dims on one side and brightens on the other. This split glow offers a hidden compass, rose, a silent arrow pointing to the sun's location. Fringe theorists assert that some Vikings mounted these crystals in bronze frames, carved with compass points, turning them into true polarization compasses, but no archaeological find has yet revealed such ornate fittings. Historians still argue whether any Viking Age craftspeople possessed the optical understanding to cut crystals at precise angles. The navigator invites you to look through the crystal toward the sky. You align it until the polarized bands converge into a single bright line. Then rotate until that line points directly toward the sun's hidden disk behind a bank of cloud. Mainstream trials with reconstructed ships off the coast of Norway have confirmed this method could achieve bearing accuracy within 15 degrees, good enough to maintain course between known waypoints. You step back, wiping sea spray from the crystal surface, and notice a young apprentice scribbling symbols in a wax tablet, two concentric circles bisected by a line marking the polarized bands. He jots down notes about blocked rays and free rays, terms he overheard from a visiting trader who once passed through Ireland. Yet some coastal communities never adopted this technique, preferring traditional sightings of seabirds and whales. Fringe observers claim cultural resistance more than practical limitations hindered polarized navigation's spread. Historians still argue whether crystal guidance was widespread or confined to elite captains. A sudden squall darkens the sky and rain spatters across the deck. You wonder if the crystal trick will survive in a downpour, but the navigator simply holds the stone aloft until the rain lets up enough to catch a glimmer of sun. It's a risky maneuver in a storm, but he insists it beats drifting blind along treacherous coastlines. You recall that less experienced sailors sometimes dropped their crystals overboard, convinced they were cursed, a fringe superstition that speaks to the human side of discovery amid danger. As the storm cloud clears, a double rainbow arcs across the sky. The navigator breaks into a grin and lifts his crystal toward the vibrant bands. You watch as each color fades in turn until only one bright strip remains. He declares their heading, and the crew shifts sails without hesitation. You press your ear to the hull and hear the timbers sigh in approval as wind fills the canvas. The morning sun returns in full glory, illuminating the deck, where water droplets cling to every rope and oar. You tuck the crystal safely into its leather pouch, noting the little scratches you've added, while marveling at its power. In the centuries to come, natural philosophers will call this polarized light and develop entire fields of study. But here and now, you're part of the first wave of navigators who turned light itself into a compass. Below deck, the Skald begins a low hum, celebrating this new power to tame the sea. You feel the gentle rock of the longship, steady assured, knowing that the mystery of polarization is no longer beyond human grasp. You settle into the gentle sway of the longship as it slips silently through mist-shrouded waters, the wooden hull whispering secrets of sagas long past. You probably won't stay dry through this next tale, as the salt spray of legend mingles with the brine of fact, yet you lean in eager for every cryptic clue. One Skald unfurls a weathered parchment, its edges frayed by time. You peer over his shoulder at swirling runes arranged in jagged columns. These saga passages penned centuries after the voyages, they describe hint at practical sunstone use without spelling it out fully. A mainstream translation notes that one verse refers to a gleaming stone held aloft to part the clouded sky, suggesting Vikings used a crystal to find the sun's hidden path, even when daylight lay behind slate-gray clouds. But as your eyes trace the poetic lines, you notice curious inconsistencies. One passage speaks of a stone of midnight brightness, while another, from a different saga, mentions a plate of light that never dims. Fringe scholars argue these could describe two entirely different tools, a sunstone and some lost form of glass mirror. Yet historians still argue whether the sagas record one singular navigation aid or a tapestry of myth and tool. You lean forward, tracing the faded ink with a fingertip. The parchment surface is slightly tacky from aged birch tar, a substance Vikings used to waterproof manuscripts. That same tar, smeared on a crystal, would have made gripping it in a gale far easier, a quirky hint that these navigators cared as much for handling comfort as celestial precision. Another stanza draws your eye. When Thorir raised the shining shard and the sky obeyed, the ship turned true upon the hidden path. You press your palm against the parchment, imagining Thorir, an obscure chieftain, whose name surfaces only briefly in coastal annals, tilting a faceted cordierite shard as jagged waves threaten to toss him overboard. Historians still argue whether Thorir was a real figure or a composite hero, symbolizing every captain who dared to challenge the North Sea's fury. The Skald pauses, letting the crackle of the ship's timbers fill the air. You glance to port, where a school of porpoises arcs beneath the bow, leaping like joyous heralds of your own discovery. Their sleek bodies glisten, reminding you that light and water have danced together since time immemorial, another mainstream fact underpinning the saga's themes of illumination. You reach for your own sunstone fragment, tucked safely in your cloak. Its edges, though rough, catch the lantern's glow like mischievous stars. You align it against the sky's reflection in a tiny puddle on deck and watch polarized bands ripple across the surface. The Skald nods approvingly, as if sensing your silent reading of the saga's hidden technical footnotes. A new parchment slips from the Skald's satchel, a fragmentary diary entry attributed to a monk who accompanied a Viking fleet to the British Isles around 950 AD. The handwriting, surprisingly neat for its era, mentions a marvel of crystal light that guided the crew through ceaseless fog. You read that the monk observed light bending through a hexagonal lens, marveling at how it revealed the sun's secret location. Fringe romantics claim this lens was cut from imported Italian quartz, implying far-reaching trade links, but historians still argue whether such precious imports ever graced a rough Viking deck. You tuck the diary slip into your cloak alongside your own crystal, sensing the weight of history pressing gently against your ribs. The Skald then whispers of a saga's closing lines, and though the sky conspired in stealth, the stone's glint led them home. You listen for hidden emphasis, wondering if that glint refers to a specific angle of polarization or a flicker of divine magic. Historians still argue whether saga authors simply draped practical knowledge in poetic cloak or genuinely believed in supernatural guidance. You look seaward as dawn's pale light shifts toward a softer, warmer hue, the mist dispersing into wisps of silver. Sailing alongside a small skiff carries supplies from the home settlement barrels of mead sacks of grain and a carved chest rumored to hold a captain's personal sunstone mounted in bronze. Your heart quickens at that image, a symbol of authority shining against the storm. Yet, no such chest has ever surfaced in Viking grave finds suggesting either skilled looting or a fiction meant to bolster a leader's legend. A hush falls over the crew as the Skald recounts a peculiar verse about another navigator who inscribed his sunstone's bearings onto a leather strip, wearing it as a bracelet around his forearm. You slide your own crystal out and wrap your fingers around it, picturing a captain turning his wrist to reveal the next course. It's a quirky detail that blends practicality and adornment, an early smartwatch of sorts. Historians still argue whether leather-bound bearings ever existed, or if this was simply an author's flourish. Your gaze drifts to the horizon now, freckled with the first distant shapes of land-jagged cliffs and crumbling monasteries that will feed future sagas. You press the crystal against your brow, feeling its cool edge, and wonder how many voyages ended in triumph thanks to that glassy slice of light. Below the deck, you sense the skald's soft humming, echoing the saga's rhythm, as if carved by wind and wave. You study the final fragment of rune text. Let no vessel wander lost when cloud and spray conspire, for the stone's truth shall pierce the murk. It reads like a stalwart promise, one penned by someone who truly believed in that guiding glow. You tuck the parchment away, letting its quiet conviction settle in your chest. As the long ship glides toward unknown shores, the saga's cryptic verses linger in your mind, their blend of myth and method, a testament to human ingenuity. Whether sunstone or simple quartz, whether poetic metaphor or precise instrument, these words have cast a clarifying light on every shadowed sea path. And you, standing at the heart of this unfolding tale, carry that sparkle forward, ready for the next revelation that waits just beyond the fog. You're perched on the edge of the quarterdeck as the longship glides into a sheltered cove, its prow crunching over a scatter of smooth pebbles. Here begins the material hunt at sea, the search for the crystals that make the Sunstone legend possible. You probably won't find a vein of flawless Iceland spar buried in these shores, but every glint of pale rock gives hope to navigators craving that decisive edge. Mainstream records tell us that Vikings knew of natural calcite deposits, often called Iceland spar, along certain fjord walls and riverbeds in Norway and northern Scotland. These crystals, when broken into clear rhombic fragments, exhibit strong double refraction, splitting a single beam of light into two identical images. You stoop hands, skimming the water's surface, searching for fragments worn smooth by centuries of tidal churn. Historians still argue whether these shards were deliberately collected for their optical properties or simply found as convenient ballast when ships unloaded heavy cargo. A crewman hefts a leather satchel, bulging with rough stones he's picked up in Shetland's shingle beaches. He offers you one, an obscure mineral called cordiorite, deep bluish gray, and less transparent than calcite, but more abundant. Its polarization effects are subtler, yet sagas hint at its use when Iceland spar ran scarce. Fringe storytellers claim cordiorite was favored on stealth missions, its muted glow avoiding unwanted attention from rival fleets. Historians still argue whether cordiorite's less conspicuous guidance outweighed its reduced clarity in real navigation. You run your fingers along the satchel's seams, studded with salt crystals from previous voyages. You recall that actual mining of Iceland spar began only in the 17th century, yet small-scale gathering must have occurred much earlier. A quirky tidbit percolates in your mind. Some Viking sites have yielded polished crystal pendants, thought to be purely decorative, but perhaps these were cutting scraps from more practical trim. You tuck that thought away, remembering the blindfolded tests in Section 3, tales of sailors gauging crystal clarity, sans sight. Your gaze shifts to a tall reeve standing near the mast clay-streaked fingers, tracing a runic map etched on an oaken plank. This map marks known crystal collection points, a rocky outcrop on the Faroe Islands, a sunlit quarry in western Norway, and a river delta in Shetland, rumored to carry glacial debris from distant highlands. You lean in, imagining the needle-like lines carved by a navigator's blade, guiding captains to these spots like a treasure map. The longship's cook shouts over the wind, brandishing a chunk of ruby-red jasper, purely ornamental, he says, though you spy a faint, double reflection when you peer through its crack. Historians still argue whether any colorless quartz found its way to Viking ships in significant quantities, or if opaque stones were reappropriated as unintentional navigational trial pieces. You toss a rope coil aside and slip over the gunwale into the shallow water, the icy North Sea biting at your calves. Beneath the surface, you scan the seabed for glimmering fragments. Mainstream divers' reports confirm that many prized crystals washed down from coastal cliffs, tumbling into coves and settling beneath shallow shoals. Yet you find only dull pebbles and tangled seaweed, proof that gathering required both patience and local knowledge. Back on deck, you lay out your finds, a few milky quartz pebbles, a fractured sliver of calcite that refracts your grin into two warped images, and a small smudge of cordiorite with a sapphire sheen. The navigator examines each, tapping them gently to listen for a distinct ping that suggests density and internal structure. You grip the smallest piece, no larger than a thumbnail, and imagine it mounted in a carpenter's frame with compass markings. A skald saunters over, curious about your haul. He recites a quirky anecdote. Vikings once traded furs and walrus ivory at Novgorod markets in exchange for polished crystals from Baltic traders. He claims these polished slabs were carried in leather pouches, passed secretively from helmsman to helmsman. Historians still argue whether such long-distance trade of optical-grade crystals happened before the Crusades opened Mediterranean routes. You pace the deck, the timber creaking beneath your feet, and remember the skald's verse from Section 5 about wearing sunstone bearings as bracelets. Maybe these small fragments you found will become personal talismans, as well as tools worn close to the skin, warmed by body heat to prevent fogging in cold air. The navigator jots a note on wax tablet, test warming technique, and you smile at the blend of superstition and practicality. As the sun climbs higher, the crew lowers a small sail to tackle low-tide shoals. You spot a cluster of black kelp clinging to rocky outcrops. Beneath, the silver flash of a crystal fragment catches your eye. Your heart leaps, and you slide across the wet planks, reaching into a crevice to retrieve it. It's a crystalline slice of calcite, faintly yellowed by algae, its surface is smoothed by wave action. You cradle it like a newborn, aware that even this single piece could save lives in an overcast storm. The navigator peers through his makeshift polarizing frame, a wooden ring with crosshairs carved into its rim. He slots your newly recovered fragment inside and tilts it toward the sun. You hold your breath as a narrow streak of light appears bisecting the sky's reflection. The crew murmurs in awe. Even the most skeptical among them nod solemnly. A fringed tale surfaces. Some say Vikings explored steaming hot springs in Iceland to find crystalline deposits hidden beneath sulfuric terraces. They'd brave scalding water to pluck glimmering stones from fissures, believing the earth's heat blessed the crystal's clarity. Historians still argue whether any such geothermal harvesting preceded coastal beachcombing or remained a fanciful aside in saga lore. You stow your prized fragment in a velvet-lined box, marking it as Section 6, Find Number 7. The navigator assigns it to experimental use once skies darken again. You settle onto a coil of rope fingers, tracing the box's velvet edge, and sense the quiet triumph of discovery. Each crystal gathered feels like a small victory over the mercurial sea and fickle sky. Your gaze drifts to distant cliffs rising in mist, tomorrow's next hunting ground. You imagine descending into hidden coves at low tide, sifting sand through wooden sieves to catch tiny glints of light. The crew prepares for sundown drills, testing each newly found piece against sunlight and sketching results in wax tablets. You inhale the briny air, tasting salt and anticipation. The material hunt continues with every wave, every shoreline, and every shaft of refracted light, a testament to Viking resourcefulness and the lengths they'd go to tame those northern seas. You're back on deck at first light, the sea calm and glassy like molten steel, perfect conditions for experimental trials. You probably won't find a storm this placid on your maiden test run. But that's exactly why today matters. You need to see how these crystals perform in the gentlest of breezes before trusting them in full gale. The navigator brings out 3 different pieces, a clear sliver of Iceland spar, a smoky fragment of cordiorite, and a roughly faceted piece of quartz. He pits them side by side on a small wooden stand carved with angular runes marking hours of the day. The crew gathers in a half-circle, breath visible in the cool air, faces expectant. First comes the Iceland spar. You watch as the navigator holds it aloft, angling it until 2 superimposed images of the distant lighthouse glimmer with equal brightness. He rotates the stone slowly, finger tracing a carved notch until one image dims and the other brightens. Then he aligns it so they match. You feel anticipation tingle in your fingertips. In that instant, the stone points toward the hidden sun, even though a bank of thin cloud still masks the disk. A murmur runs through the crew. It works. Next, cordiorite. Its surfaces are less pristine, and when held aloft its double image is faint, almost ghostly. You lean in close and see two pale outlines of the lighthouse tower, but the shift between bright and dim requires extra care. The navigator grunts approval. This one can work, but only in perfect light. You tuck that tidbit into the back of your mind, recalling that cordierite shards were more plentiful, but demanded seasoned hands. The final trial is quartz. You hold the fragment yourself, lifting it until you catch a flicker of polarized glow. It's subtle, like the memory of a dream, but enough that a practiced eye could follow it. The navigator encourages you to feel for the bright band. You rotate the quartz in your palm, all the while the sun's hidden position registering as a soft line through the stone. You grin when you see it align, proof that even a pedestrian crystal can guide a ship, if only just. A sudden gust fills the sails, and the stand clatters to the deck, its stones sliding across planks. You instinctively dive to catch the Iceland spar before it shatters. Your heart thuds as you secure it in your pouch, a reminder that these trials can turn dangerous in an instant. Historians still argue whether such experiments took place on pitching waves or only in sheltered inlets. Either way, the risks were real. The navigator pulls down a canvas tarp and sketches results in chalk Iceland spar, excellent, cordierite, good, quartz, limited. He adds tally marks beside each, counting successful readings over failed ones. You note that on this calm morning spar scored 10 out of 10, cordierite 7, and quartz 4. A quirky aside occurs to you. Some captains preferred quartz not for clarity, but for its cheap sturdiness. Dropping it overboard didn't ruin the voyage. Historians still argue whether quartz's durability made it more beloved in rough hands despite weaker performance. A lone gull cries overhead, its wings slicing through the silent dawn. The navigator pockets the chalkboard and collects the crystals, placing each back into its leather pouch. He instructs 2 apprentices to stow them in waterproof wooden boxes lined with wool to prevent chipping. You help secure the lids, feeling the soft rustle of wool against crystal, an unexpected comfort amid the raw wood and iron fittings of the ship. Next, the crew prepares for a timed experiment at local noon. At exactly 12 bells, the navigator steps to the center of the deck, unpacking the Iceland spar and a small wooden gnomon carved with notches for each hour. You stand ready to call out the moment when the crystal bands align. The sun peeks through a break in the clouds and you shout, "Now!" The navigator tilts the spar and a sharp line of bright light splits the deck's shadow, pointing true south. You feel a thrill ripple through your chest. It's the moment theory becomes reality. Afterward, the navigator measures the bearing with a simple sighting vane, comparing it to coastal landmarks. The result is within 10 degrees of the known direction, an astonishing feat for a single crystal on waves. Crew members clap quietly, as if afraid to disturb this revelation. You share a conspiratorial grin with the helmsman, imagining how useful this tool will be when they venture beyond familiar shores. As the sun climbs higher, the mist rises off the water, and the navigator challenges you to try. You hold the spar between thumb and forefinger, feeling its triangular shape steady in your palm. Through it, the lighthouse's twin reflections dance, and you twist until they merge, just as you saw a moment ago. You hold it steady, then glance to seaward. Ahead lies open ocean, with nothing but sky and water for compass. You tuck the spar safely into your satchel, knowing that on future nights your compass may lie in this very fragment. A deckhand brings 2 bowls of hot tea, an Arabian import, prized for its warming spices. You sip slowly, the steam curling in your face, and marvel that these same traders once crossed Viking routes on camels laden with exotic goods. You pass the spar to the deckhand and he tilts it experimentally, murmuring appreciation for its reliable glow. Fringe stories mention that some crews would add burnt bone ash to the crystal's surface to enhance contrast, but historians still argue whether abrasion ever improved performance or simply wrecked precious fragments. You stand at the rail, tea in one hand, spar in the other, gazing at horizons that no compass could once conquer. The vessel's keel cuts a straight line through the blue, guided by nothing more than polarized light and human ingenuity. You breathe deeply, inhaling salt and possibility. Below deck, the skald begins composing a new saga of the crystal that tamed the North Seas. You can almost hear the lines forming each verse a tribute to the experimental trials you've just witnessed. You slip the spar back into its leather pouch and slide it into your cloak, readying to join the skald in verse or to test the stone again beneath the midnight sky. As the longship sails steadily on, you feel a gentle confidence settle over you, replacing the earlier cautious excitement. Today proved that these shimmering fragments aren't mere legend. They're honest-to-goodness navigational tools. Tomorrow, you know the real challenges will come with low clouds and storm-tossed waves. But for now, you have daylight and crystal clarity on your side. You settle beside the navigator, near the mast, the longship gliding through calm seas as sunlight dances across the waves. Today you delve into the optical mechanics of polarized light and crystal axes, the hidden science that turns ordinary stones into sea-crossing compasses. You probably won't master crystal optics in a single morning, but by the end of this session, you'll grasp how light itself became a tool of navigation. The navigator lifts a clear slab of Iceland spar and holds it aloft, letting the sun's rays slice through its rhombic angles. You notice 2 identical images of the horizon. One offset, one true. This is double refraction, a mainstream phenomenon, first described by ancient natural philosophers, where a single beam splits into ordinary and extraordinary rays as it passes through certain crystals. The effect is stunning. 2 overlapping worlds each shifting as you twist the stone. He rotates the spar, slowly aligning one image atop the other until one dims and fades, leaving only a single bright outline. That bright outline marks the polarization plane, light waves oscillating in a single direction. Polarization occurs naturally when sunlight reflects off water, scattering sideways and aligning waves horizontally. Mariners noticed that glare changed with the sun's position, a fact that puzzled early scholars yet provided the raw material for this invention. Historians still argue whether Vikings deduced these principles through systematic observation or stumbled upon them by happy accident. The navigator explains that the crystal's optical axis, the direction along which light passes without splitting, runs through its body at a precise angle. When you orient that axis perpendicular to polarized rays, you see one image vanish, a clear pointer to the sun's hidden position. You test this by holding the spar before your eye, rotating until the double image collapses. A bright line remains, slicing through the seascape and pointing true south. Nearby, an apprentice demonstrates with a piece of cordierite. Unlike Iceland's spar, cordierite's optical axes vary with crystal orientation and show weaker double refraction. You peer through its gray-blue surface, catching only a faint ghost image that wavers like a mirage. It works, but demands patience and an unwavering hand. Some captains preferred cordierite for its muted glow under stormy skies, believing subtlety kept their roots secret from rival fleets, a quirky naval tactic that historians still argue formed part of Norse skirmishing strategy. You step closer as the navigator places the spar inside a bronze frame etched with compass points carved by a skilled smith. This prototype frame holds the crystal steady and features a sighting slit opposite the spar. You peer through the slit, aligning the frame so that the bright polarization line points directly through the notch. Beyond lies the horizon's edge, and you mark your bearing by reading the nearest rune-etched index. This fusion of metallurgy and optics is pure Viking ingenuity, blending runic artistry with practical science. A breeze ripples across the deck, and the navigator reminds you that crystal temperature affects refractive indices. On cold mornings, the spar can crack under thermal shock if pulled suddenly from its wool lining. He warms it in his palm before each use a quirky handling technique that doubles as a ritual of respect for the crystal's power. Historians still argue whether this warming ritual originated for practical reasons or evolved into a ceremonial rite among elite navigators. Below deck, the skald resumes his chant, weaving technical details into poetic couplets. You catch a line about rays of Sol converging in glassy heart, which hints at understanding the crystal's core optical function. Yet, next verses speak of light's twin spirits dancing, suggesting a mythical interpretation coexisting alongside scientific insight. You ask about edge angles and why the spar must be cut so precisely. The navigator pauses, tracing the outline of the crystal, then admits that steep cutting angles around 30 degrees from the crystal's face yield the clearest polarization effect. Achieving such precision requires metal files and grinding on sandstone wheels, tools seldom found aboard ships. Fringe lore claims master cutters worked on shorelines before voyages, producing sunstone blanks to specification. But historians still argue whether widespread, consistent cutting ever occurred, or if each piece was an improvised work of art. You lift the crystal once more, this time with a small leather glove to prevent fingerprints from scattering light. The navigator watches as you rotate it, and when the ghost images converge perfectly, he nods approvingly. He explains that each crystal's unique birefringence, its degree of double refraction, depends on chemical composition and internal lattice structure, meaning no two sunstones are identical. Navigators learn to catalog their favorite stones by name or origin, some even naming prized specimens after chieftains or mistresses. Historians still argue whether formal catalogs existed or if memory alone guided crystal selection. As you practice seagulls, wheel overhead, and the hum of the crew trimming sails creates a lullaby of wood and rope, you notice that, unlike the spar and cordierite, a piece of common quartz shows no double image. Quartz polarizes light too, but without obvious splitting, requiring a separate polarizing filter to reveal its effects. Yet you remember Section 7's experiment. Even quartz provided enough guidance for rudimentary direction, finding a testament to human adaptability. You recline on a coil of rope, holding the spar overhead and looking skyward by angling it until the two images of clouds merge you a line with the sun and call out your bearing. The helmsman nods, trusting that invisible compass line. It feels like wizardry, but you know this is perfected. Optical science, born from countless trials and seafaring necessity. Minutes pass and you switch to a simpler tool, a thin slice of mica, its layers separated into near-transparent films. When placed before the spar, it enhances polarization contrast. You stack the mica on top of the spar and look through both. The effect is startling, a razor-sharp bright line cutting through gloom like a blade through mist. This combination may never have been widespread, but it suggests Vikings weren't shy about experimenting with composite methods. Historians still argue whether such layered devices appear in any surviving artifacts or remain speculative reconstructions. The navigator takes notes on wax tablets, drawing diagrams of axes, beams, and lines. He calculates that on overcast days, with broken cloud cover, this method yields bearings within 20 degrees, a remarkable accuracy for pre-compass navigation. You lean in, tracing a runic sketch of the crystal's cross-section, imagining how those angles etched knowledge into living rock. A curious deckhand asks if polarized light works at night. The navigator laughs. Polarization vanishes without the sun, though some believe moonlight polarization aided occasional nocturnal voyages under a full moon. Historians still argue whether Vikings ever attempted serious night navigation with crystals, or if they simply moored until dawn. You tuck the spar into its padded box and stand stretching muscles stiffened by concentration. The ship's steady sway brings you out of your trance, and you survey the horizon through human eyes, now attuned to light's hidden compass. Each beam you captured through the crystal feels like a secret, whispered by the sun itself. As the longship sails toward distant headlands, you realize that mastering these optical mechanics transformed seafaring from instinct and luck into a science of angles and light. The sea no longer seemed an inscrutable expanse, but a navigable realm, guided by invisible currents of polarized rays. You smile, imagining the next expedition, where this knowledge will carry you and your fellow Vikings beyond charted waters into the vast unknown. You lean over a slick stretch of deck, dusting off seawater spray, as the longship drifts above a submerged wreck. Today you delve into the archaeological evidence that brings sunstone legends from sagas into the realm of hard artifacts. You probably won't unearth a perfectly preserved sunstone compass from beneath these waves, but every shard and fragment tells part of that story. Divers return from below with barnacle-encrusted timbers and a handful of small crystal pieces recovered from Danish coastal sites. Mainstream archaeological reports confirm that cordierite and Iceland spar fragments have indeed been found amid Viking shipwrecks dated to the 10th and 11th centuries. These shards were often tucked in wooden chests alongside navigational tools like bone toggles and simple lead weights used for sounding depths. Historians still argue whether these crystals were stowed for decoration ballast or navigational purposes. You study a battered oak chest on deck, its iron hinges rusted almost beyond recognition. Inside, tiny calcite fragments lie scattered, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries beneath mud and mussels. A quirky tidbit emerges as you handle each piece. One fragment shows faint groove marks, as if cut by a skilled tool rather than breaking naturally. This suggests a deliberate shaping, an early form of crystal cutting that anticipated modern optics. Historians still argue whether such carved facets were functional precision work or merely rough preparation for ritual use. The ship's master archaeologist places each piece on a broad cloth, labeling them with runic-style tags, denoting their find locations: the Skuldalev wreck near Roskilde, the Cirkland trader ship off northern Norway, and a modest fishing vessel beached on Shetland sands. You notice that the size, shape, and transparency vary widely. Some shards are crystalline white, others dusty gray. Yet every sample reveals traces of use where tiny scratches oriented along preferred axes, as if each crystal was repeatedly gripped and tilted toward light. You reach for a particularly clear sliver of Iceland spar. It's only 2 centimeters across, but still sparkles when held aloft. Under a magnifying lens, you discern microabrasions along its edges, evidence of scraping on a coarse, grinding stone. Fringe researchers claim these marks match techniques used in medieval Venetian glass cutting, implying knowledge exchange between northern traders and Italian artisans. Historians still argue whether such specialized cutting methods traveled north before the Hanseatic League cemented Baltic trade links. Below deck, the crew assembles a temporary lab, a wooden table lit by lanterns, calipers, and metal tweezers. You help rinse shards in fresh water and gently pat them dry with oilcloth. A diver's journal describes finding a single intact crystal within a navigational chest, unusual given how prone these stones are to fracturing. Its pristine condition hints that it may have been protected in a leather case lined with wool, exactly as modern experimenters recommend for preserving delicate optics. You hold that intact piece carefully, feeling its edges, neither too sharp nor too worn. You suspect it once fit snugly into a carved wooden frame, its transparent face aligned precisely to capture polarized light. A fringe theory suggests the frame was adorned with runic inscriptions, invoking protection from storm gods, blending practical optics and magical invocation. Historians still argue whether rune-etched frames ever existed, or if they remain a fanciful blend of myth and material science. A skald quietly recites an old verse he found among the wreck's planks, stone of soul, in cedar bound, held aloft when night surrounds. The language hints at both ritual reverence and instrument-like intent. You note that mainstream epigraphy confirms runic inscriptions on wood and bone, but no known runes reference crystal optics explicitly. Yet the verse suggests at least one navigator believed the stone's power extended beyond mere light measurement. As you catalog fragments, you uncover a small leather pouch emblazoned with a faint sun emblem. Inside lies 3 quartz pebbles, each inscribed with a simple knotwork pattern. These pebbles likely served as backups when primary crystals failed, an example of redundancy in Viking gear. You tuck one inscribed pebble into your own pocket, its carved pattern a reminder that form and function intertwined in Norse lives. Historians still argue whether these patterned pebbles were navigation aids or symbolic talismans carried for good fortune. You move to a second wreck site where divers uncovered a bronze mount shaped like a horseshoe. Its inner cavity holds the outline of a triangular crystal. Though the actual crystal is missing, likely looted centuries ago, the mount's shape precisely matches a 2.5 centimeter spar fragment you saw earlier. This mount may be the closest thing to an actual sunstone frame ever found. A quirky detail, microscopic analysis reveals traces of dried fish oil on its inner walls, suggesting sailors oiled their crystals for clearer readings in damp conditions. Historians still argue whether fish oil was used for optics or merely preserved wood and metal in harsh marine environments. You settle by the rail, turning over these stories in your mind as the sun dips toward the horizon. Each artifact, no matter how small or incomplete, serves as a breadcrumb, leading you deeper into the Viking navigator's world. The raw fragments speak through the ages, whispering of hands that carved and tested, of voyages guided by slivers of light. The master archaeologist invites you to sketch the bronze mount and its missing crystal on a wax tablet. You draw the triangular outline, noting runic flourishes along its rim. You add a caption, Section 9, Reconstruction. As you draw, you imagine fitting a new slab into that mount, turning it until the bright polarization line slices through fog and gloom. A final diver's note describes uncovering a crude wooden gnomon alongside several crystal shards. This gnomon, a 2-foot timber rod with notch marks carved at intervals, would have served as a makeshift sundial in clear weather, another time-tested navigational fallback. The combination of gnomon and crystal suggests Vikings layered tools for redundancy and precision, not relying solely on one method. Historians still argue whether such multimodal navigation was widespread or limited to elite expeditions. You tuck the diver's notes into your satchel, feeling the collected weight of centuries of exploration and experimentation. Each fragment and record binds you to a lineage of navigators who dared to trust glints of polarized light as the ultimate guide. Below deck, life carries on nets, are mended sails repaired, and fish stocks checked. But above you, linger on the deck's edge, eyes drifting to the darkening sea. You clutch a polished quartz pebble in one hand and a copper mount sketch in the other, feeling the tangible link between myth and material. The longship's prow points steadily toward distant horizons. You breathe in the salt-tanged air, the acrid smoke of lantern tar, and the faint echo of sagas. Archaeology, you realize, has pulled these ancient navigational tools from shadowy legend into concrete form. And as you prepare for the next section, where academic debates will roar like wind through rigging, you know that every shard you handled here will fuel the stories to come. You stand on the quarterdeck as the wind picks up white caps forming on the sea surface, and the ship tilts gently under the surge. Today, you weigh legends against evidence, diving into the scholarly debates that rage over whether Sunstones truly guided Viking ships or merely served as fanciful saga decorations. You probably won't settle these arguments before nightfall, but by dawn you'll understand why historians remain divided. On one side, mainstream maritime scholars point to experimental reenactments during the 1990s, where modern recreations of Viking vessels navigated North Sea crossings, using only sunstones and sunrods, achieving routes within 10 degrees of accuracy. These trials, conducted under varied cloud cover, suggest that polarized light navigation was not purely mythical, but had genuine practical value. Yet, critics note that these experiments relied on modern understanding of optics and precise crystal cuts, resources unavailable to medieval craftsmen. Historians still argue whether Viking Age seafarers possessed the skill and knowledge to replicate such controlled conditions on rolling decks. A quirky counterpoint arises from a fringe group claiming that some sagas describe sunstones glowing in the dark, hinting at bioluminescent inclusions or magical enchantments. They point to a passage in the Flate Jarbok where a navigator's stone flares with inner fire as dawn breaks, guiding his ship through a moonless night. Mainstream scholars scoff at literal readings, but admit that the saga's poetic language complicates literal interpretation. Historians still argue whether such descriptions encode real phenomena like phosphorescent lichen on coastal rocks, or simply embellish seafaring prowess for dramatic effect. You pace along the railing, feeling the brine blow across your face, and recall a recent conference where archaeologists debated whether crystal fragments found on the Gokstad ship were intentionally shaped for navigation or merely chipped by storm-tossed cargo. One camp cites microscopic faceting on several shards, suggesting purposeful preparation. The other attributes these marks to incidental contact with metal tools aboard, noting that no dedicated crystal-cutting instruments have been excavated from Viking sites. Historians still argue whether the absence of cutting kits undermines the case for intentional sunstone crafting, or if such kits simply decayed beyond recognition. A deckhand ties a new coil of rope as you reflect on the documentary you watched last winter, where researchers used replica sunstones during a 2017 crossing from Norway to the Shetlands under 4 hours of heavy overcast. The team reported bearing accuracy within 12 degrees, enough to reach known islands safely. Yet skeptics emphasize that the film crew provided detailed weather reports and satellite support, a luxury ancient Vikings lacked. Historians still argue whether controlled reenactments can truly replicate the unpredictability of genuine Viking voyages. You glance at the navigator, who's comparing saga excerpts with academic papers spread on a wax tablet. He points out that some saga authors wrote centuries after the events they describe, raising questions about the reliability of oral tradition. For example, the 13th century saga of Sverrir the Bold attributes sunstone use to 9th century explorers, but no contemporary references survive. Yet you remember that Norse culture prized careful memorization of sagas, often recited by skalds with remarkable fidelity. Historians still argue whether oral transmission preserved technical details intact over centuries or gradually transformed them into legend. A sudden gust sends spray over the deck, and you wipe your jacket before diving deeper into the debate. You think of the Royal Society's 18th century experiments on Iceland spar that first documented polarization and double refraction, the very same crystal discovered centuries earlier by Norse eyes. That revelation prompted some scholars to retroactively imagine Viking optical knowledge illustrating how modern science can reshape our reading of history. Historians still argue whether charming retrofitting of sunstone lore reflects genuine continuity or creative anachronism. Leaning against the mast, you recall another fringe assertion that Vikings used multiple sunstones of varying thickness to triangulate the sun's position, achieving far greater accuracy than any single crystal allowed. Proponents point to skaldic verses describing 3 stones held in each hand, but no archaeological site has yielded matching trios. Critics counter that handling 3 fragile shards simultaneously on a rocking ship would be impractical, risking all tools overboard. Historians still argue whether multi-stone triangulation ever moved beyond poetic invention. You step forward as 2 apprentices reenact a mock trial, one holding a clear fragment aloft, the other reading off compass coordinates from a carved bone disc. They simulate a storm by slapping boards with paddles, then laugh as the crystal flakes a corner, an apt illustration of sunstone fragility. This demonstration sparks a question: if sunstones were so delicate, why rely on them in harsh conditions? Some argue that Vikings carried backup quartz pebbles for emergencies, while others claim sealed, lantern-style housings protected crystals. Historians still argue whether practical shielding methods existed or remained lost to time. A hush falls when the skald begins reciting a poem where a hero loses his sunstone in battle and must navigate by the North Star alone for 3 days, only to be rescued by a wayward albatross that guides him home. The line blurs between myth and debate. Did sagas invent narrative crises to dramatize navigation or preserve genuine sea trial experiences? Scholars still argue whether such episodes encode actual events, storms that shattered crystals, or crafted moral lessons about human fallibility. You recall that in some academic circles, skepticism runs so deep that even the term sunstone is questioned, proposed as a later invention by romantic antiquarians rather than a genuine Viking navigational implement. Yet, you've held calcite fragments excavated from wrecks, seen their grooved facets, and felt how they split light. That tactile certainty sits uneasily with purely textual skepticism. Historians still argue whether the balance of physical evidence outweighs gaps in documentary proof. The Navigator offers you a warmed shard of Iceland spar. You cradle it, marveling at its cool surface despite the growing sun. He reminds you of a recent peer-reviewed paper proposing that cloudy conditions above the Arctic often yield enough polarized light for reliable readings, a finding that bolsters sunstone proponents. Yet others caution that real-world atmospheric scattering varies too unpredictably for ancient seafarers to trust the method fully. Historians still argue whether environmental variability rendered polarized light navigation intermittently useful or consistently dependable. A wave laps against the hull with a steady thrum, and you sip from a wooden cup of spiced ale, considering the debates you've witnessed. Each argument carries weight, empirical experiments, archaeological finds, saga, verses, and practical reconstructions all point toward sunstone use. Yet each also harbors uncertainties that keep the controversy alive. You stare seaward as the vessel glides past rocky skerries, the horizon shimmering like a promise. Whether sunstone navigation remains a half-remembered myth or a misunderstood reality, you can't deny the power of human imagination and ingenuity it reveals. Some skeptics may never be convinced, and some believers may overlook practical limits, yet the debate itself propels exploration of both sea and scholarship. Below deck, the skald turns commentary into new verses, and you sense the friction of idea against tradition, forging fresh insights. You tuck the spar into its padded pouch, resolve stealing in your chest. Tomorrow you'll sail under new skies, applying these contested lessons to guiding the ship through uncharted waters. You crane your neck skyward as the longship glides beneath drifting clouds, each sail furling and unfurling like a living creature. Today, you join a modern crew on a replica Viking vessel retracing ancient sea lanes, using nothing but sunstones, sunrods, and the same winds that once carried Norse explorers. You probably won't match satellite precision, but you will feel the pulse of history beneath your fingertips. Before dawn, you board the experimental ship docked in Bergen Harbor, its clinker-built planks gleaming with fresh tar. A team of maritime archaeologists greets you in woolen tunics and leather boots. They explain how in 2002 a similar reconstruction sailed from Norway to the Faroe Islands, relying solely on sky-reading techniques, arriving within 20 nautical miles of their target island, an astonishing repeat of 9th century voyages. Historians still argue whether those trials can fully replicate the spontaneity and risk of real Viking crossings. You settle into a wooden bench beside the mast, watching as the navigator unfolds a schematic replica of a sunstone frame built from bronze recovered at a Shetland wreck site. He fits a triangular spar fragment into its slot and points out the crosshair alignment marks etched along its rim. Mainstream documentation from the 2002 voyage notes that this precise frame design helped stabilize crystal orientation even when the ship rolled up to 30 degrees a feet, that saved modern crews from losing their bearings in moderate swells. As the vessel slips into open water, the navigator raises the frame, catching a sliver of diffuse sunlight leaking through patchy clouds. He rotates it until the twin images you remember from earlier sections merge into one. A bright line appears, slicing through the haze and pointing toward the sun's hidden disk. Your heart races as you call out the bearing, and the helmsman adjusts the steering oar. Moments later, the ship turns gracefully, guided by an invisible compass. You sip hot tea, spiced with ginger, an import not available to ancient sailors, but a welcome modern comfort. Daylight arrives in earnest, and the crew sets to work testing alternate crystals. You join two apprentices as they compare Iceland spar to locally quarried cordierite. In one trial, the spar yields a reading within 8 degrees of a GPS waypoint. In the next, cordierite falls off by nearly 20 degrees under the same conditions. A quirky observation emerges on overcast afternoons with uniform gray skies. Cordierite sometimes outperforms spar because its muted birefringence avoids glare confusion. Historians still argue whether Vikings deliberately selected cordierite for those specific weather scenarios or simply used whatever crystals they had at hand. By lunchtime, you're trimming sails with the deckhand, listening to him recount how in 2014 a reconstruction voyage from Iceland to Greenland used sunrods and sunstones to maintain course for over 250 nautical miles, suggesting that Vikings could indeed bridge vast ocean gaps. Yet skeptics note that modern crews benefit from detailed satellite weather forecasts and emergency support vessels on standby. Historians still argue whether these safety nets invalidate experimental successes or merely reflect prudent risk management. In the afternoon, you gather in a circle as the navigator leads a workshop on sunrod calibration. You hold a length of polished ash with a brass tip and mark the sun's height at local noon using a simple angular notch system. Mainstream accounts affirm that such sunrod readings allowed Vikings to estimate latitude with surprising consistency, often within 1 degree. Yet, when you compare your sunrod measurement to the crystal frame's bearing, you notice a 3-degree discrepancy, a small gap that could mean tens of miles off course at sea. Fringe enthusiasts insist combining both tools solved that gap. Historians still argue whether dual-tool navigation was standard practice or a fringe innovation. Later, the crew convenes in the galley to review log entries from past experimental voyages. You read how teams noted sunstone failures during heavy rains, when water droplets on the crystal's surface scattered polarized light unpredictably. To counter this, some sailors devised leather hoods to shield the stone during readings, a clever hack you saw reconstructed ashore. Historians still argue whether these improvised rain shelters were widespread or rare improvisations. As the sun dips toward the horizon, you join a mock night watch. Under a thin crescent moon, you try using a spar fragment to locate the hidden moon, its polarized glow, faint but discernible. Initial trials are inconsistent. Readings vary by up to 30 degrees. You and the navigator share a wry smile, acknowledging that moonlight navigation likely remained experimental at best. Historians still argue whether moon-guided night voyages ever became practical or were abandoned as too unreliable. Dusk brings a gentle hush over the crew. The navigator invites you to stand at the bow for a final reckoning. He holds the crystal frame aloft. You recite the bearing, and he notes the ship's heading against known lighthouses glowing on distant shores. The result is gratifyingly close, a mere 7-degree offset. You exhale, feeling the weight of centuries lift from your shoulders. This hands-on experiment confirms that under favorable conditions, sunstone navigation could indeed carry Vikings far from home. A deckhand brings bowls of hearty stew, smoked fish, barley, and root vegetables. You eat while listening to the navigator explain that modern replicators often overlook subtle details, the way ancient sailors stored crystals in cloth pouches to prevent thermal shock, the rituals of warming stones in gloved hands, and the oral training passed from father to son. All these factors combine to make polarized light navigation not just a gimmick, but a genuine seamanship skill. Historians still argue whether such training persisted widely or became a closely guarded secret among elite captains. Night fully settles as the ship anchors in a sheltered cove. Lanterns glow amber around you, and you help hang the crystals in padded leather cases above the main hatch. You tuck your own fragment into a velvet-lined box, each crystal now more than a relic. It's a key to unlocking ancient horizons. As you crawl into your bunk in the cramped forecastle, you replay the day's trials in your mind, the precise alignments, the experimental mishaps, and the triumphant bearings that matched seaborne waypoints. You realize that modern reconstructions don't just replicate old voyages, they rekindle the curiosity, courage, and creativity that drove Vikings to cross unknown seas. Below deck, the Skald whispers new verses about modern heirs to the crystal's light, bridging past and present in a single song. You close your eyes, the lull of waves and the faint hum of sail ropes lulling you toward sleep. You position yourself at the prow as the longship leaves sheltered waters and enters the broad expanse of the North Sea, the horizon stretching in every direction like a promise etched in salt and sky. Today, you trace the practical sea routes that Vikings carved across these restless waters using crystal-guided navigation paths that would become the highways of Norse traders and raiders alike. You probably won't cover every mile these routes once spanned, but by sunset, you'll understand how polarized light and careful mapping stitch together distant shores into a connected world. Even before sunstone navigation emerged, early Viking routes hugged familiar coastlines south from Norway to the Orkneys, then west toward the Hebrides, down Ireland's eastern seaboard, and onward to the Isle of Man. Mainstream annals record that by the mid-9th century, Norse traders had established regular sailings between Bergen and Dublin, carrying walrus ivory furs and slaves. These journeys relied on pilotage, landmark sighting, and knowledge of prevailing winds, but beyond the open water, no chart existed. Historians still argue whether these early pilots recorded rudimentary coastal charts on animal hide or relied solely on oral wayfinding. You unfurl a faded leather scroll marked with runic annotations, each symbol indicating a headland, a shoal, or a favored anchorage. The navigator points to your left, a small rune that denotes Fair Isle, an essential waypoint between mainland Scotland and the Orkneys. He explains that when skies darkened, sailors would raise a crystal to locate the hidden sun, then steer toward the next rune-marked point, verifying their course by glimpsing that craggy isle through gaps in low cloud. Without that glimmer of polarized light to guide them, open sea passage would have been a cold gamble. An apprentice stands beside you, tracing finger-width lines on a wax tablet that represent sea lanes linking Iceland to Greenland. You watch as he marks 3 key legs, the first across the Denmark Strait. Then a broad arc along the southern Greenland coast, finally skirting an ice edge to reach eastern settlements. Mainstream sources tell us that Eric the Red's voyages around 985 AD established these routes, founding colonies at Brattahlid and later the western settlement. These crossings span hundreds of nautical miles, often under murky skies, impossible without some method to find the sun's bearing. Historians still argue whether those settlers relied on sunrods alone or combined them with fragments of sunstone for improved accuracy. You lean in as the navigator adds a small dot marking Kjalarnes Head in Iceland, the point where many Vikings first glimpsed land after 3 days at sea. The lore says that some ships sailed so close to the Arctic Circle that the sun never set in summer, confusing sunrod readings. A fringed tradition whispers that crews carried fine threads of silver to tilt crystals at minute angles, compensating for the midnight sun's glare, an ingenious hack, if true. But historians still argue whether such precious implements ever truly graced Viking decks. Turning the scroll, you see a looping route from the Faroes westward to the Shetlands, then south past the Scottish Mull of Kintyre into the Irish Sea. Trade centers, like Waterford, founded by Vikings in 914 AD, appear as rune rings, while smaller fishing inlets appear as simple dots. The navigator explains that compiled coordinates from sunstone readings became oral sea atlases, memorized by captains and passed down through generations. Without written charts, these verbal maps formed the backbone of Norse maritime commerce. You point to a series of dashed lines stretching from Dublin across the Irish Sea to the Isle of Man. Modern reconstructions show that by the 10th century, Norse Gaelic chieftains controlled these waters, running regular ferry-like crossings in fine-lined carves. These ships, smaller than your longship, nonetheless used the same crystal-based bearings to make the open crossing swiftly and safely. A quirky note in the navigator's wax tablet mentions that some captains penned simple verse mnemonics, short rhymes, referencing rock shapes and cloud patterns to help align sunstone readings at specific waypoints. Historians still argue whether such poetic devices formed an integral part of navigational training or served merely as memorable shipboard lingo. Your eyes follow the scroll's windings to the western approach of Dublin Bay, where a cluster of runes denotes sandbanks known as the mouth of the Liffey. Mariners arriving from Scotland had to thread narrow passages through shifting bars. You recall that modern experiments demonstrated sunstone readings could mark the exact angle needed to slide between reefs, especially when combined with local knowledge of ebb-tide currents. Mainstream maritime archaeology confirms that Viking anchors, shaped like spiders with multiple flukes, helped maintain position while readings were taken. The navigator taps a rune by the Isle of Man, motioning toward the Solway Firth. He explains that Norse settlers in Man used a hybrid navigation style combine coastal landmarks by day crystal bearings by overcast morning. Often sagas note that ships would aim for the little church ruin on St. Patrick's Isle, its white tower serving as a visual beacon when polarized light bearings fell within 5 degrees. Historians still argue whether such coastal landmarks were pre-surveyed as part of systematic route mapping or simply discovered through trial and error. A deckhand brings you a ceramic cup filled with warm whey, a staple of Norse seafarers. You sip as you watch the navigator trace a series of curved lines toward the Hebrides and down along Scotland's west coast. These loops indicate return routes, accounting for prevailing winds and currents sailing south during the calmer summer months. Then, angled crosswind runs to close the loop northward. Sunstone readings allowed captains to dial in the precise angle of these tacks, reducing reliance on wind-driven drift. Fringe sources claim that mastered captains even adjusted sail shapes based on crystal-derived angles of solar incidence, trimming yards to align with optimal wind vectors, an elegant synthesis of solar and aeolian navigation. Historians still argue whether such advanced sail-shape tactics really emerged in the Viking Age or surfaced later among Mediterranean sailors. You lean closer to see a network of red-tinted runes marking the Baltic Sea routes, linking Gotland to Estonian trade towns. The navigator notes that Vikings sailing into the shallow Baltic often faced dense fog banks rising from brackish waters. Here, sunstone bearings outmatched landmark sighting when visibility fell below a few dozen meters. Mainstream Baltic maritime records reference these techniques in passing, but few codify them, suggesting knowledge was shared guild style among trading families. Historians still argue whether this Baltic transmission of sunstone lore passed northward to shape North Atlantic navigation or vice versa. In the eastern Mediterranean, you notice scattered runes marking Constantinople and Cyprus. These reflect Norse mercantile expeditions under the Varangian Guard, a body of elite Viking warriors serving Byzantine emperors. Unlike coastal traders, these adventurers set sail through unpredictable seas, relying heavily on precise sunstone-based bearings once beyond familiar waters. A quirky marginal note on the scroll mentions that Varangians sometimes carried small glass orbs, rumored to betray polarized light even under forest canopy, another saga of terrestrial adaptation. But historians still argue whether inland polarization navigation ever worked or was narrative flourish. You stretch out as the scroll's final lines trace a grand arc from Norwegian fjords across the North Sea to Britain and Ireland, onward to Iceland and Greenland, looping back through Arctic passages to Spitsbergen and beyond. These practical sea routes, honed over centuries, connect a network of trade, colonization, and raiding that defined Viking influence. Today you feel that network course through your fingertips, each rune-etched line representing lives lived on the edge of maps. The navigator rolls the scroll, tucking it into a waterproof tube. He turns to you, eyes bright. These routes, he says, are born from countless crystal readings, sagas of trial and error, and oral traditions that recorded bearings as if they were runic poems. You nod, imagining generations of captains murmuring soft verses as they tilted their sunstones skyward. Historians still argue whether these routes were ever formally documented outside memory, or if each voyage was a standalone cartographic achievement. You rise to your feet as the longship sails toward its next waypoint, the wind filling your sails in a steady rush. In your hand rests a small wooden stylus, ready to press the final rune into your own wax tablet map. You place the tip at your current latitude, guided by crystal clarity, and draw a line toward sunset's glow. As you stand there, rune carving in hand, you sense the living map beneath your feet. A web of sea lanes scrawled by polarized light carved into the minds and memories of those who dared seek lands unseen. Following these routes, you become part of that lineage, charting familiar waters once more, with sunstone and sky as your compass. Dusk settles as the longship crests a gentle swell, and you sense the sunstone's legacy beginning to wane in the face of newer tools. Tonight, you witness the eclipse of crystal compasses by iron magnets and detailed charts, an evolution that would render sunstones nearly obsolete. You probably won't see a real compass needle here, but the whispers of change drift in the wind and crackle through the sails. By the early 12th century, compasses likely borrowed from Mediterranean traders started appearing on European vessels. Mainstream maritime records note that the first compasses used simple lodestones, naturally magnetized rocks, that pointed north when suspended. These devices, while crude, delivered constant direction without needing clear skies. Historians still argue whether Vikings ever experimented with magnetism before adopting compasses, or adhered longer to tried and true crystals. You lean against the mast, recalling that Chinese explorers may have used lodestone compasses as early as the 11th century, and that knowledge filtered west along trade routes. Meanwhile, astrolabes and more sophisticated sundials began circulating among European courts. Yet, on this deck, the sunstone still holds pride of place, its glow a reminder of an era when light and stone guided your world. A deckhand approaches, demonstrating a small brass compass he won in Constantinople. He places it on the deck beside the dwelling crystals, and you watch as its needle jitters before settling northward. You feel a twinge of nostalgia. This tiny magnet could simplify navigation, yet lacks the poetic clarity of a split beam of sunlight. Fringe enthusiasts lament that compasses invited new errors, magnetic deviation near iron-rich shores. But historians still argue whether these early compass frailties outweighed their all-weather convenience. Below deck, the navigator spreads out newly commissioned sea charts, parchment maps, with coastlines drawn to scale latitudes, marked by sunrod readings and compass bearings inked in. These charts charted a revolution. Captains could now plot waypoints without staring skyward. You run your finger along the Orkney-Shetland route, tracing a line smoother than any memory-based scroll. Yet, a whispered aside suggests that some elder navigators preferred sunstone readings to verify compass reliability, especially when compasses swung wildly in high latitudes. Historians still argue whether sunstones and compasses coexisted in practical harmony, or if one method rapidly displaced the other. A skald begins a quiet chant about iron's faithful heart, conquering crystal light, contrasting the sunstone's fickle brilliance with the compass's steadfast pulse. You catch the refrain, "No more cloud or night can hide our way," a lyric signaling the compass's promise. Yet your heart tugs toward the sunstone's magic, remembering how it cleaved fog and gloom alike. The navigator demonstrates a combined method. He takes a compass bearing, then holds a sunstone sliver to confirm true north. In clear weather, both align within a few degrees. When clouds gather, he trusts the compass alone. A quirky note emerges. Some medieval authors claimed sunstones could still correct compass errors caused by local magnetic anomalies, a fringe claim that historians still argue has any real basis, or is simply retrospective myth-making. You join apprentices at a drafting table, comparing charts drawn by hand before compasses to those sketched after. The earlier charts feature runic mnemonics and poetic verses marking hazards. The newer ones rely on latitude-longitude grids and compass roses. Both styles convey essential information, yet the new grid system scales far more easily for long voyages. Mainstream cartographers credit Portolan's detailed, compass-based maps developed by Italian sailors for spreading this system across Europe by the 13th century. Historians still argue whether Norse traders adopted Portolan charts directly or modified them through existing oral traditions. A deckhand brings you a small wooden case containing a star chart and a brass astrolabe tools that measure celestial angles at night, far superior to moonlit sunstone readings. You hold the astrolabe sighting vane before you aligning it with Polaris. The instrument's calibrated arm allows you to calculate latitude with greater precision than any crystal shard could manage. You marvel at this mechanical marvel. Yet you can't help but trace your fingers over the crystals tucked in your cloak, feeling their raw edges and recalling every shimmer of polarized light. On deck, the navigator fits a tiny magnetic needle into a float of resin and moss, creating an early compass. He warns that iron-bound tools aboard your ship must be stowed carefully to avoid skewing the needle's accuracy, a practical limitation compasses didn't face when mounted to deck. You nod, realizing that compasses brought new technical demands: calibration tables, iron-free storage compartments, and knowledge of magnetic declination. Historians still argue whether these complexities slowed compass adoption among less technically inclined sailors. A sudden breeze dims the final rays of sunset, and you light a lantern. You slide a cordierite fragment into the leather pouch and feel its familiar weight. Soon, you'll stow crystals away as curiosities prized for their history, but no longer essential tools. Yet tonight, before compass needles rule the night, you stand in the glow of half-remembered lore, where polarized light once guided entire fleets. You recall that even when compasses took hold, sagas still extolled sunstones as symbols of Viking daring. They became ritual heirlooms, passed down in families as trophies of bygone seas. Fringe collectors today sometimes search wrecks for sunstone artifacts, blurring the line between antiquarian obsession and serious scholarship. Historians still argue whether any surviving heirloom stones belong to navigational toolkits or served purely as ceremonial relics. As the lantern light flickers across charts and crystals, you feel the hush of transition from hands held aloft in open air to the pinprick of a magnetic needle. Each method has its champions and detractors, each era its navigational creed. You slide the case closed on your sunstone collection, knowing tomorrow you'll lean on compasses and charts more than crystal lore. Yet, tonight you honor the legacy of light-guided paths that once wove the tapestry of Norse exploration. Below deck, the skald captures the evening in new verses. From crystal's gleam to iron's point, our courses shift through time. You absorb those lines, feeling the tide of history turning beneath your feet. You watch the compass float, tremble, then settle true north, and you exhale slowly. The sea's pulse remains the same, but the tools have changed. Sunstone, sunrod, and sagas fade into memory as compasses, astrolabes, and charts chart the future of navigation. Thus ends the Sunstone's reign, its legacy etched in legend and crystal shards still waiting beneath waves. You wake to the hush of dawn slipping across a glassy sea, the sails hanging limp in a still breeze, as if reluctant to leave the softness of night. Today you witness how the legend of the Sunstone has transcended medieval lore to inspire modern scientific inquiry, where myth and empirical study entwine like kelp in the tide. You probably won't uncover a new sunstone buried beneath laboratory equipment, but you will see how crystal navigation resonates in laboratories, observatories, and even spacecraft experiments. Mainstream researchers at the University of Rennes have demonstrated that traces of polarized skylight exist even under heavy cloud cover and through layers of ice crystals, confirming that Vikings may have enjoyed far broader optical opportunities than once thought. Their peer-reviewed paper details how modern sun polarimeter data from Northern Europe show discernible polarization patterns more than 40% of the time, especially during low solar elevations at dawn and dusk. Historians still argue whether such favorable conditions occurred reliably enough for consistent Viking navigation, or if they represented fortunate but intermittent windows of clarity. You stand at the rail as the navigator unfurls a printed graph showing polarization angles measured at varying cloud thicknesses. The graph arcs like a letter S, dipping, where cumulus drift thickens, and spiking under thin stratus. You trace its curves with a gloved finger, marveling that centuries after sagas were sung, scientists now quantify what ancient mariners intuited. Fringe enthusiasts point to a niche study claiming that ice crystal hexagonal plates in Arctic skies amplified polarization signals, yielding stronger cues than open water glare alone. An elegant theory suggesting that sunstone navigation peaked in polar summers. Historians still argue whether Vikings understood and exploited this ice-scattering boost, or if any such advantage remained unrecognized. Below deck, the archaeologist-scientist team loads crystal shards from wreck sites into a spectrophotometer. You peer through its viewport as a laser sweeps across a cordierite fragment, mapping its birefringence characteristics in digital color bands. The device hums softly, and you watch the data accumulate as brilliant stripes of blue and green interleaved with milky white. A quirky tidbit, some shards from the Gokstad wreck show trace amounts of manganese inclusion, suggesting they crystallized under volcanic conditions, an improbable origin that links Norse navigation to ancient Icelandic eruptions. Historians still argue whether such geochemical signatures held any navigational significance or served only as geological curiosity. Back on deck, you meet a polar research grant-funded expedition team testing crystal frames on an icebreaker in the Barents Sea. They mount a replica sunstone frame on the ship's rail, adjacent to a modern polarizing filter sensor. As they tilt the frame and record alignments, you observe that their readings match within just 5 degrees of the digital sensor's output, even when the sun hangs low and clouds scatter in wispy veils. Mainstream polar met journals have hailed these findings as proof that polarized light navigation could operate alongside GPS as a resilient backup in high-latitude expeditions. Historians still argue whether such backup use equates to genuine historical precedent or reflects present-day enthusiasm projecting onto the past. You wander to the ship's science lab, where geologists are curating a small exhibition crystal fragments labeled circa 950 AD alongside peat samples spun in 21st century centrifuges. Each fragment sits under a glass dome lit by adjustable LED spotlights. You lean in, noting how subtle color variations in cordierite correspond to slight differences in polarization efficiency, data points that would have escaped any Viking eye, but now illuminate the nuances of ancient seafaring. A fringe note mentions that in laboratory conditions, certain crystal orientations produced brightness, contrasts, visible even in fog, echoing saga claims of sunstones cleaving mist like steel. Historians still argue whether such dramatic anecdotes describe rare meteorological events or imaginative saga artistry. Above, the navigator stands beside a drone hovering at the ship's masthead, equipped with a mini polarimeter. The drone sweeps in arcs, testing polarized light gradients over open water. Data streams to a tablet, and you see colorful heat map overlays matching the polarization graph from Ren. You feel a shiver at the irony. Vikings once trained their eyes to catch hidden light bands by hand, and now flying robots capture the same signals for scientific posterity. Mainstream remote sensing conferences have cited these drone experiments as potential new methods for monitoring ocean-atmosphere interactions, blurring the line between historical curiosity and real-world climate science. Historians still argue whether such cross-disciplinary synergy reflects a meaningful Sunstone legacy or strikes too self-referential a chord. A sudden gust ruffles the maps pinned to the forecastle wall, and you secure them before they flutter overboard. One map displays GPS tracks of replicative voyages across the Norwegian Sea, overlain with markers where crystal readings matched satellite-derived polarization fields. The navigator points out segments where readings failed areas of sudden fog or pitch-black cloud. Those brief gaps remind you that even the most sophisticated crystals can't guarantee guidance in every condition, mirroring ancient uncertainties that sagas spin into dramatic tension. You sip a cup of strong reindeer herb tea offered by the expedition's ethnobotanist. She explains how Sami guides once taught Norse explorers to interpret sky color shifts and wind-borne sensory cues that complemented crystal readings. A quirky folklore note: some Sami shamans used similar crystals in shamanic rituals to pierce the veil between worlds, suggesting a shared cultural appreciation for refracted light as a bridge between the known and unknown. Historians still argue whether Norse and Sami optical practices influenced each other or developed independently under convergent environmental pressures. Later, you join a discussion in the ship's conference tent, where polar optics experts debate whether sunstones could ever guide spacecraft through extraterrestrial atmospheres. One researcher proposes using calcite-based sensors to measure polarization in Mars's dusty skies, while another raises practical hurdles, dust abrasion temperature swings, and unknown grain orientations. Yet, the very idea adapting Viking-inspired optics for interplanetary navigation speaks to the enduring spark of creativity ignited by a simple medieval crystal. Historians still argue whether drawing such parallels honors the Sunstone's legacy or dilutes its meaning through overextended metaphor. As midnight approaches, and you remember that on these high-latitude voyages, the sun scarcely dips you step onto the deck to watch faint twilight painting the horizon. You hold a small crystal disk, its edges smoothed by centuries of handling, and tilt it toward the lingering glow. It fractures the light into polarized bands that slice across the dark water like ghostly tracks. In that silent moment, you sense the continuum from saga singer to lab researcher to drone pilot, all united by shimmering arcs of light. You cradle the disk and whisper a soft tribute. From dawn of Viking sails to labs of modern ken, your light guides still. Below deck, the skald improvises the final lines of a new saga verse about stone-born science mirroring sky's own code. You smile, knowing that myth and science, once distant cousins, now stand side by side under a polar sky. The longship glides on its course, steady, buoyed by ancient inspiration and cutting-edge research alike. In the interplay of myth and measurement, you glimpse a profound truth that human ingenuity spans eras, embracing both the poetic and the precise. You stand at the ship's stern as the sea stretches endlessly behind you, its surface a mirror reflecting dawn's first rosy hues. Tonight, you reach the final chapter of this crystal-lit odyssey, a whispered farewell reflection on the Sunstone's glint, its promise, its power, and its poetic echo through history. You probably won't hold another sunstone after this watch, but its resonance will linger in your mind like the drift of a distant song. The navigator approaches, holding a small triangular fragment of Iceland's spar, the last of the crystals you gathered. You cradle it gently in your palm, its cool edges pressing against your skin. Mainstream accounts remind us that by the late Viking Age, crystal use had become specialized prized slivers passed from captain to captain, each stone bearing the marks of countless journeys. You trace faint groove lines etched by hands as anxious as yours, a tangible link to mariners of old. A soft breeze carries the scent of pine smoke from the stern lanterns. You lift the spar carefully and hold it toward the emerging sunlight. The crystal fractures the dawn glow into two overlapping images of the eastern horizon, each dancing as you rotate the stone. When the double images merge into one, a bright line appears, a silent arrow etched in light, pointing toward home. That line feels like a heartbeat beneath the sky, steady and true. You recall a quirky anecdote. Some helmsmen tied their sunstones to leather straps around their wrists believing that constant contact kept the crystals warm and free of dew. Historians still argue whether such rituals served practical anti-fogging purposes or were simply superstition cloaked in folk wisdom. You imagine that each captain's ritual was as unique as the stone itself, embedding crystal handling into the very rhythm of seamanship. Below deck, the skald's final murmured verses drift upward, celebrating the stone as Saul's own tear guiding lost souls. Yet you know that beyond myth, these crystals embodied an ingenious blend of observation craft and daring. Historians still argue whether the practical methods were universal among Vikings or the guarded secrets of an elite few. The debate feels like an unending tide shaping understanding, even as waves reshape the shore. You press the spar's corner against your temple, feeling its edges warm with your pulse. The crystal seems to hum beneath the lantern light, a faint resonance that echoes the ship's creaking timbers and the slosh of water against the hull. You close your eyes and imagine waves of polarized light rippling across the sea, invisible currents guiding every course correction made under overcast skies. A gull's distant cry slices the momentary silence, reminding you that nature holds its own compass, one born of instinct rather than instrument. Yet human hands learn to capture that hidden guidance in quartz and cordierite, expanding the boundaries of exploration. Mainstream studies of Viking roots confirm that sunstone-guided voyages reached Iceland before the end of the 9th century, a testament to those early trials on wind-lashed seas. You replace the spar in its velvet-lined box, careful not to scratch its delicate surfaces. Your fingers linger on its lid, hesitating as if reluctant to seal away that bright glimmer forever. The crystal's power lies not only in polarized light, but in its symbol, human curiosity etched in stone, a spark that ignited voyages across uncharted waters. The navigator offers you a final cup of warming mead. You sip slowly, the sweet warmth spreading through your chest as you reflect on this journey. Fringe lore suggests that some navigators believed shards of sunstone retained rays of the sun itself, granting them prophetic dreams of future routes. Historians still argue whether any Viking ever truly believed in such magic, or if these stories are narrative flourishes born in later retellings. You lean against the rail mead in hand, listening to the gentle slap of water against wood. Each sound feels amplified in the hush of early morning. You recall the saga fragments and archaeological shards, the experimental trials and modern reconstructions, all threads woven into this tapestry of light and legend. In the last pale glow, you whisper a silent thanks to the mariners who first held these crystals aloft, trusting that a hidden beam would reveal the sun's secret path. Their courage resonates now in every glint you've chased and every horizon you've dared to breach. As the ship turns gently toward the anchorage, you inhale the mingled scents of salt pine tar and lingering mead. The world feels both vast and intimate, a horizon shaped by wind wave and the faint pulse of polarized light. You feel the long ship's slow sway under you, each rock and roll softening the edge of wakefulness. The mead's warmth settles in your veins and your muscles relaxing beneath the subtle vibration of wood and water. Words fall away as your mind traces the last shimmer of crystal light, letting images drift like clouds over a twilight sky. Every lesson of the sunstone, its double refraction, its polarizing power, now blends into a gentle hum of understanding. No longer does each glint command your full attention. Instead, it becomes part of a larger rhythm, the harmony of wind against sail, the distant call of gulls, the whisper of waves caressing the hull. You allow yourself to listen to that rhythm, letting it guide your thoughts into softer currents. The crystal's glint lingers behind closed eyelids, a warm glow that ebbs like the tide. You recall hands weathered by salt and spray, tilting stones toward pale skies, trusting in light's secret compass. That trust now anchors you, a quiet reassurance that even in darkness, guidance can emerge from the simplest beam of illumination. Your breath deepens, sinking with the vessel's lullaby. The mead's sweetness fades, replaced by the pure taste of salt air as you drift toward rest. You feel weightless, unburdened by the vastness of the sea or the complexities of history. Instead, you rest in a space where myth and method fold into a single calming truth, that discovery begins with curiosity and glimmers brightest when shared. Soon, the longship will rest anchored in a sheltered cove. In dreams, you'll revisit horizons traced by polarized light and recall the soft click of crystal axes aligning with the sun. But for now, you close your eyes, surrendering to the gentle sway and the promise of peaceful slumber. Sweet dreams await, carried on a beam of light that once guided Viking sails and now guides you into night's embrace.